Hello, friends. Hi, guys. Lots of folks jumping on. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to get situated. It's funny to see how fast people can react now to Zoom based on today versus the last webinar. In our last webinar, we needed to give people a few minutes to kind of figure out how the Zoom technology works. I can tell you've all had 10,000 Zoom meetings since the last webinar. And that's part of quarantine. So hi and welcome. Glad you're all coming in. If you're just hearing my voice, we're just giving a few minutes for people to kind of jump in and figure out the technology a little bit. And then we'll get underway. As we're doing that, guys, and I'll probably go back over this again before we get too deep in, but just want to remind you, if you're here in Zoom, I know some of you are watching on other platforms, you're Skyping in, you're on Facebook, your other places as well. So if you're there, we're trying to monitor those things as well. So feel free to add things to comments or, do whatever you can. But there is, if you look up in the, somewhere in your toolbar, it's probably at the top, but it might be on the right-hand side as well, or somewhere. You're gonna have a little toolbar and it says Q&A. You can either use that to talk to our group, or you can also use the chat feature, which you can grab by going up to the more. You should see a little ellipsis, a little 3 dots up at the top. And you're seeing already our moderator, Virginia. She's my partner. And here in Modern Mortgage, she's really the director of community engagement. So she'll be a great resource for you if you have any questions, trouble, technological stuff. Virginia Shank's about the best there is out there. So she can help you with all of that stuff. So more folks still rolling in, so we're just going to kind of give people just a couple of minutes to get in, and then we'll get underway. But in the meantime, I want you guys to know a little bit about how our time today is going to work, and then I'll go back through an introduction, which I know is kind of a backwards way to do it. But the way our time is going to work today is I'm going to take you through a presentation. Hopefully that presentation is going to be really, really useful information for you today, because my goal is to help you understand the world around you, the world around me, so that you're kind of empowered to make really, really good decisions. And so as we go through that, I want you to have a lot of freedom today to kind of jump on the chat, ask a question. You can send it just to me, or you can send it to Virginia. You can send it to the whole group if you want, however you feel comfortable doing that. But I want you guys to feel really comfortable just to make this a time that's useful for you. We're going to have lots and lots and lots of people on this webinar today. So also, if you guys wouldn't mind, just as we're beginning, do us a favor. I have to admit, and I've said this before, I am so bad at the kind of, I don't know what you would call it, like the self-promotion part of this. And we're really trying to learn that stuff. So if you guys would like, share, and subscribe us, that'd be great. Because we find that the information, the group of people that we're talking to is a really just dense, strong group of people in lots of high places. And so it's been really interesting to see our content go out and be useful to people. We want to keep doing that. I don't really care how big we get, but I will tell you, I want this information to be as influential as it can, because I think we can really help people. So you guys are part of our community, and we're so grateful for you. So take advantage of it. Jump on the chat, talk to us about things you want to know about. It can be specific, it can be macroeconomic, it can be big, it can be little. It can be about what's going on in your house, and it can be what's going on geopolitically in the world. I won't claim to be any kind of a special expert, but I will tell you this: I'm adept at the synthesis of information, and have really built my life, my various businesses on this very thing. And so hopefully going to be helpful in helping you do that. So, all right. Well, as we begin, we've got lots of folks pouring in now. We see on all kinds of different locations. So thanks for being in here. And we'll go ahead and get underway. Let me introduce myself. My name's Adam Hebener. I'm the CEO of Modern Mortgage. And Modern Mortgage is really just delighted to be able to bring you guys the content that we're going to bring you today. If you got to see our last webinar, we got to talk a lot about the inner workings of what I believed at the time was the thesis for the problem. And that thesis was that we were in a liquidity crisis. Now, at the time, that wasn't the consensus. Most people were saying, hey, liquidity's fine, rates are going to come down. We were telling you liquidity's not fine and rates are going to stay flat or go up. And in fact, that thesis has continued to prove out over time. And so you're seeing the fruit of that being true now being borne out. Now, the reason I'm explaining that to you is because I want you to know really the theme of the conversation we're going to be going through today is really all about how to understand what, how to separate out kind of a real actionable thesis from what is just noise. And there's so much noise around us all the time that my biggest concern is that you guys get information that you can't use. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I believe what is happening, why we're seeing some of the wrong moves we're seeing, and then I want to equip at least our small little island to be making better decisions. So again, for those just joining, I see new people kind of hopping on. Welcome. I'm Adam Heavener. I'm the CEO of Modern Mortgage, and let's go ahead and get started on this process together, and eager to bring you what we're talking about. So guys, here's the deal. What you should be seeing on your screen right now is the title page here, The Battle of the Narratives. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my video just to make sure that my stream is coming through really strong to you. And if you guys need any thing from me on that front, then let me know. Okay, here we go. All right, hopefully you can still hear me, and we'll start taking you through a presentation. Can you guys hear me? I want to make sure we're looking good. All right, good. We can hear me. That's great news. Okay. I'm just having a little stall here on the presentation. It's not wanting to go through. Forgive me guys one moment as I get our technology working here. All right, good. Great. Hi guys. Audio cutting in a little bit. Okay, we'll try to, now that I've cut video, I've got a face for radio anyway, so hopefully this this helps. Glad to have that encouragement. All right. Hey guys, here's how you want to get in touch with us. If you've got questions, if you haven't had a chance yet to get involved in what we're doing on social media, you know, take that moment while you've got your phone next to you, pull up Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever you like to get your information, and follow us there. And then if you don't mind, send us out to your friends and other folks. If there's things we can be doing specifically for you, then jump on at hello@modernmortgage.com, and that'll take you right to our team that really is involved in all the kind of community development stuff. So that's where we're going to be serving you guys specifically. All right, so let's get underway. Let's start talking. This is what you've been hearing all the time. You probably the most common word I've been hearing over and over again is that we are in unprecedented times. And I think that's true. In some sense, what we're observing is unprecedented. And yet, in many ways, I don't think it's true. And the fact that you see this, quote, unprecedented, you'll hear this every day on the news, unprecedented financial happenings, unprecedented medical happenings in every kind of category of life, we're seeing things that are unprecedented. And look, there's a limited use to apply that word well, but the reality is, the fact that we see this as so unprecedented, I think is part of the problem. Now, if you guys have attended any of my classes, and I see so many familiar names, you guys have seen classes I've done all the way back to late 2016 was probably the first time we started introducing you to what I believed would be a recession that we of course thought would come in October of 19. Now, obviously we were a little early on that, thinking October of 19. But the reason that I'm bringing it up is not because I want to toot my horn. It's because I want to give you confidence in knowing that there is actually a framework to help us understand what's going on around us. And I think if we understand that framework, I don't think unprecedented is really the right description of what's happening. So rather than get into just things that are going on around us, I want to introduce you to some other ideas. This is one of my favorite writers. This is Mark Twain. And of course, you've probably heard him say this famous quote, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." And I think that's true. And if history does have anything to teach us in this time, I want to be hearing more about it, and I want to be introducing you to more of it. And so I'm also, while we're working on this, I think it's noteworthy that Mark Twain was the first guy to really pioneer the Corona haircut and the Corona mustache, and definitely the coronavirus eyebrows. So I'm hoping that's coming back strong. But look at this. We went a little bit too far. My computer's kind of jumping around here a little bit, guys. But let's just go back in history. I want to introduce you to a couple of ideas that I think are worth your consideration. The first is the Panic of 1857. The Panic of 1857 is interesting because it was a liquidity crisis caused by a stock price collapse that ended up seizing the bond market. Now, I wonder if that sounds familiar to you at all. If you were on my last webinar, then you know that what we're dealing with today is a liquidity crisis that was caused by the stock price collapse that seized the bond market. Pretty fascinating to think about. Now, at the time, some of the little changes were a little bit different. There were some, obviously, they weren't dealing with the digital world. They weren't dealing with the coronavirus. But the liquidity crisis at the time occurred as a result of basically a tariff war that was going on between the United States and then Western Europe, mostly the UK, but France was also included, and Spain was also included. And there's basically a tariff war that came about as a result of unfair kind of global, we'll call them globalistic tendencies that favored UK dry goods over US dry goods. And people didn't like that. There was a growing political discontent. And as a result of that discontent, there was a tariff war that kind of broke out. That tariff war, along with a tax cut, kind of had the effect of overheating the economy to some degree. And as the economy overheated, the result was that there was a run on railroad bonds. There was a bank in the Midwest, there's actually an Ohio bank, that had a run. That bank, as a result, created a contagion that went to, kind of rolled out from there. I'm trying to, as I talk about this, decide how deeply to go into the crisis. I think I won't go into the absolute details of the crisis, but I just want you to know that this panic occurred. Now, at the time, there was a president, presiding president, James Buchanan. He was US president from 1857 to 1861. He was a one-term president. At the time, he was considered kind of a political outsider. He was venerated because of the wealth that he had earned outside the political world. He actually was a lawyer, and a very successful lawyer at the time. And his law had to do mostly with the exchange of dry goods, commerce. He was kind of, you could think of him as kind of a corporate attorney, not a political attorney. Now, he did move into politics early into his career, but he was still considered an outsider because he had had the ability to kind of avoid most of all of the fights that had kind of come up in society at the time. And in fact, was an ambassador, foreign ambassador. And so the public at large, and certainly his own party and the opposite party, at the time that he was running, really considered him a lightweight. He didn't really win party support until after he was able to gain what we would today call swing voters. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that they were called swing voters back then, but there was more parties in the United States. There was a group called the Know Nothings, the Whigs. There were other kinds of folks that were out there. But basically, he had a way of speaking, which at the time was venerated because it was a kind of flowery way of speaking, but not so flowery that it alienated kind of the working class people. And so as a result of that, he was ended up being popular with those who were not particularly concerned with politics. He got those outsiders first, was considered an outsider himself, and then was elected president to everyone's surprise. Now, James Buchanan, as history considers him, is actually considered one of the worst presidents in US history. And I would tell you some of that is unfair. He doesn't probably deserve that in every way, but he did make one fatal error. And that fatal error was that he failed to recognize what I would call the big shift. Now, if you guys have been listening to our Modern Minutes or anything I've been talking about over the last many weeks, you've been hearing me sort of frame this idea of there being two narratives. And I think that's true. There tend to be two narratives that develop. One of them is dominant for so long that it becomes what we call the status quo. And that status quo is the result of just rules that are built, agreements that are made, and then those rules and agreements hold over a period of time. And the period of time is the larger period of time of any given section in history. You could rely upon the status quo to be true, and the rules of the status quo to be true. And you can think of big sections of history that are governed by a certain way of thinking. If I were just to say the Middle Ages, for instance, you might have all kinds of thoughts come into your mind. You might see things like a sort of dominant authoritative Catholic Church. You might see feudalistic rule, those kinds of things ruling over Western Europe. And they stay that way for long periods of time. And all those rules are right and work and run society. They're effective until they're not. And if you are a leader at the time that those rules change, history remembers you as either a great leader, if you are able to anticipate the rules changing and conduct yourself accordingly, or a poor leader if you're not able to. And I think what I'm going to contend is that it doesn't make sense when we look at James Buchanan. He's kind of considered a failed president, mostly because he failed to recognize the big shift of his day. He used old rules. And I'll explain to you slightly what that is. If you remember from your high school civics class, you might remember the Dred Scott case, where the Supreme Court basically said that the federal government really has no right to tell the states that they can't own slaves. The federal government essentially is too weak to do that. Well, James Buchanan really ran his presidency under the idea that, hey, the federal government is weak. It really shouldn't have a lot of strength. That had been true since the 13 colonies, since George Washington. This weak federal government that really doesn't have the right to interfere is a big deal. Let me see, I'm getting some notes from you guys. We'll try to send you outline notes when bullets, not on slides. Okay. Are you guys currently seeing the slide for James Buchanan? Okay, cool, we're good. All right, so I'll keep proceeding then here in the short term, but just know this, the error that James Buchanan made would have been the right decision for any other president. And in fact, if you go back to our founding documents, you'll see that in the founding documents, a weak federal government is largely what was the goal. And in fact, George Washington himself championed having a weak federal government in 1776, right? So here you are now in 1857, you're about 80 years later, roughly 80 years later, and now you've got a president who 80 years later is still following George Washington's original directive, but is finding out that the idea of having a weak federal government is probably the wrong move. Well, you guys may or may not know what happened in history, but I'll just give you a quick brief primer. What happens is, towards the end of Buchanan's presidency, the South secedes. The South acts on the idea that the federal government has stated its own weakness, and because of its weakness and their desire to keep slaves, they leave. They literally secede from the Union, and of course the Civil War breaks out as a result. Now, right after this weak, yes, Paul, quote, weak in the sense of limited powers versus the sovereignty of the states. That's right. They wanted a weak federal government that didn't have the capacity to dictate to them what was right or wrong with regard to slavery. And so as a result of that, it became a huge issue. And of course, the Civil War breaks out afterwards. Now, right after James Buchanan, you get a little known president named Abraham Lincoln. And at the time, Lincoln himself had been considered an outsider. He wasn't anybody you might famously know. He ran for office many, many times, not just the presidential office. He was considered kind of not suited to leadership. And so his capacity to come in from the outside and actually ascend not only to the presidency, but to be elected 2 times president. Of course, he was assassinated early into his second term, to preside over the Civil War, to do all kinds of incredible things. All of that came as a result of Lincoln's ability to understand the rules during what you would call a big shift. A big shift is kind of a bridge in history. And these bridges tend to come up here and there. And as they come up, those bridges are periods that take us, those shifts, they take us from one status quo through what I like to call a big shift into a new status quo, which we'll eventually call the new narrative. And what I'm going to contend for you guys today, as I know lots of new people have come on, what I'm going to contend for you guys today is that what you're currently experiencing is a big shift. And because of we're in a big shift, all of the old rules need to be rethought about. Some of them are going to make it through this big shift into the new narrative. But most of them, many of them, are not only going to not help, but are actually going to become big problems. They're going to make things worse. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like as we go. So now, look, maybe that was just a one-off, right? I love this. Not sure if that's, quote, normal or not, since it's just a one-off, right? Is it a one-off? Did that just happen one time? Well, maybe it just happened one time and I'm grasping at straws and it's too much for me to look at the Panic of 1857 and compare it to where we're at today. But let me just, if I can, add for you a little bit more context. Let's jump forward, not too far into the future. And what you're going to find is a panic you know a lot more about. This is going to be really the second big global panic. The first big global panic, by the way, is the Panic of 1857. That's the first time the globe is affected by American economic activity. The second time it happens is the Great Depression. And you might notice some similarities. The Great Depression is really a deep liquidity crisis caused by a stock market crash. The features of it are an extreme class warfare, huge global downturn, a backfired tariff war meant to favor US products that, of course, doesn't work. And indeed also a pretty substantial tax cut that also occurred. I don't know if this is sounding familiar to you guys at all, but it's a lot like reading from a playbook we've already seen. And I'm trying to add a couple of different bullet points to each one of these slides so that you can kind of understand some of the features. All these features, though, are really features of both crises. This just allows me to introduce kind of new ideas as we go. So globally, you see the rise of nationalism. You're seeing the seeds of World War II planted, just like you're seeing the seeds of the Civil War being planted in Buchanan's presidency. And of course, we have another president, probably, if possible, the only president who ranks lower than James Buchanan in terms of history's memory of his ability to be the president. And I just want you to see a few features of the president. He was himself a political outsider. That might sound a little bit familiar to you. Of course, I'm talking about James Buchanan. Earned his wealth outside of politics, earned it in business. Sounds a lot like James Buchanan. Did that prior to his role in politics. He presided over the time over an extremely divided nation, which was divided between the haves and the have-nots, the wealthy and those who were not wealthy. And he really only won party support very late in the campaign after he gained, again, the quote, the swing voters. In his case, it was women and progressives. But at the time, a progressive wasn't quite the same way we would define a progressive today. It wasn't so much liberal as it was actually conservative, believe it or not. But those progressives, think of those progressives as being kind of moderates today. So his ability to appeal to women and to moderates, that's the reason that he gained mass appeal. He did that because he had a very strange background. He was an orphan. Both of his parents died early in his life. And he really was a bootstrap guy. So the kind of blue collar, the women, the moms, the moderates themselves, which at the time, again, were called progressives, they saw him as a hero and saw him as a guy who would have the ability to really bring in for them representation in Washington. So he cuts taxes, $160 million, even as he increases several efforts to expand the government itself. And he sets immigration quotas, similar to what Buchanan had done with African Americans at the time, what he had done with slaves. He made policy that was based on race. Herbert Hoover did the same thing. And when he set quotas, that doesn't mean quotas they were trying to reach. It means quotas that they would not allow you to exceed. So they had enough of each people group. You get to a certain number of Irish, you're done. You get to a certain number of Chinese, you're done. You get to a certain number of Italians, you're done. And of course, those were the unwanted races of the day. And so I just think it's interesting. Something to consider about him is that he failed to recognize the big shift from the status quo. And at the time, it was the idea that once the Great Depression began, and of course it began again as a result of kind of overheating the economy had too much liquidity coming into it originally, and because of debt, that same thing that happened in 1857, that seized up. And as soon as the debt flow ceases, then you get a liquidity crisis, not unlike the liquidity crisis of 1857, and frankly, not unlike the liquidity crisis that we're showing you today. And so I'm interested to know, I wish I could see your faces, when it comes to considering the sort of rhythm that's in front of you right now, if any of this looks familiar to you at all. Now look, I get that anytime we have a conversation about this, it automatically becomes kind of political. And if you're on the right, you feel like anything I'm going to be communicating here is against specifically Donald Trump or is somehow politically motivated. And if you're on the left, you're going to feel the same way by a lot of my comments. Buchanan was on the left, Herbert was on the right, Herbert Hoover was on the right. And so I am agnostic to the political parties in this. I just want you to be able to step back from all of the noise that you're hearing. Stop picking a side for a little while and just observe the narrative. Just ask yourself, whether left or right, does it really matter? Do you see these features? Do you currently observe in the landscape today a deep liquidity crisis caused by a stock market crash? I think you do. Now you might say, well, the cause of the stock market crash was the coronavirus, and you'd be right. That's what we call a catalyst. But the liquidity crisis itself is not explained simply by a catalyst. It's the crash that occurs as a result of the catalyst. Do you look around and see extreme class warfare? Is there a big difference between the haves and the have-not? Is that a conversation that our society is currently wrestling with? Do you observe a huge global downturn? Have you recently observed a tariff war that's meant to sort of favor U.S. production, good, bad, or indifferent? Have you seen us cut taxes? Do you see the rise of nationalism around you anywhere? For instance, are you looking around seeing, thank you for that. Are you looking around and seeing this question? Does this start to rhyme for you guys? Are you looking around and seeing some of these other features out there? Are you seeing the rise of nationalistic leaders, for instance? And what do I mean when I say a nationalistic leader? I mean a leader who says, our place first, our place first. Those folks had names back in Hoover's day. Hitler was one of them. Stalin was another one. He would have been a nationalist. Mussolini was a nationalist. FDR, frankly, was a nationalist, right? And if you go back in history, you'll see the same kinds of people rising. If you come forward in history, do you see those same kinds of people rising? Do you see, think about this, in the 90s, for instance, we saw a huge Asian power growing in the East. And everybody told me when I was in high school, I was gonna have to learn their language if I wanted to do business. And of course, they were gonna take over the world, their capital structures, their ability to manufacture, their ability to get products into the markets. And who was I talking about then? It wasn't the Chinese, it was the Japanese. But think of the leaders that they had during the 90s. The Japanese leaders were globalistic leaders. They were leaders who were saying, hey, let's work with America to grow. Same thing, the European leaders, let's work with the United States. Let's work with other nations. And of course, that's when you start to see the real rise of, say, the EU, things like that, European Union and the pivot to Asia. That was all kind of globalistic, let's work together. But is that what you see today? Is that what you're observing now? Do you see leaders who are saying, hey, let's kind of hold hands and grow together? Or are you seeing leaders who are saying, we're all not getting fair deals, let's deal with our own deals first, let's take care of our own people first? the leader of Russia, for instance, Vladimir Putin? Is this a guy who has everybody else's best interest in mind? Or is this a guy who is what we would describe as a nationalist, a Russia first guy? Boris Johnson, who's in the ICU right now. Hope he gets out, hope he does well. Even our own President Trump, a nationalist, right? Now, again, I am not using nationalism as a pejorative. I'm not saying that this is bad. There are good features to it and there are bad features to it. I'm just saying it is what it is. A nationalist is a nationalist, good, bad, and indifferent. And so that's really what I want to be impressing upon you, is that you've seen this stuff before. And so I hope that makes sense. Now, I hope that I've established the idea that you've seen this before. I think the question now is, are you seeing it again? And I think that's a reasonable question to be asking, because we can look back in history and see what some of these shifts have looked like in the past. If we're in a big shift now, though, what should the table look like? In what way would the table be set? What kind of elements would we see set before us? Well, there's a couple of things we would need to see. We would need to see a global stock market crash that seizes a bond market and leads to a liquidity crisis. I wonder if you guys see that around you. You'd probably need bombastic nationalistic world leaders arising across the globe if you were going to be in the same period. You'd probably need policy decisions that fit earlier paradigms, right? They not only fail to address problems, but they actually make them worse, right? So do you see people doubling down on the old rules? So for instance, one of the old rules would have been in 2008, we would have said, I'm just going to start to apply this very specifically to my industry. Let's just talk banking. 2008 had a liquidity crisis, and in that liquidity crisis, the Fed stepped in. And the Fed said, hey, we are going to come up with this plan. The plan is that we're going to buy some of the troubled assets from banks. And they called it TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. That was the very first thing that the Fed did in the 2008 crisis. And you may or may not remember, but George Bush was still president at the time. The Fed met with the Treasury Department, and this is when they came up with the phrase too big to fail. We've got to come in and back up these banks. They're too big to fail. And so the way they backed them up was they proposed originally that they would spend, they would create a facility that would have a maximum spending capacity of $800 billion. And I don't know if you remember this, but the world set on fire. When they said they would spend $800 billion, people freaked out. The idea that the Fed would spend $800 billion was unthinkable. And of course, at the time, everybody wondered, could this happen? Is this real? Will this bankrupt the nation? And of course, it didn't bankrupt the nation, because what happened is the Fed was able to prove itself efficacious, meaning it worked. The tools that it pulled out of the belt were actually sufficient to change the direction of the banking industry at the time. So they came in, they bailed out these bad assets, and they moved people in the right direction. And in so doing, they proved that that $800 billion could be paid back by the economy at large. And so now, I wonder if you're seeing the same things. If you're seeing the Fed take action similar to what they had done before. Well, just as a quick recap, it was only 3 Sundays ago, that the Fed came out in the evening and of a Sunday night and said, hey, tomorrow in the morning, we're going to spit $750 billion into the marketplace. We're going to open up on Monday and start easing $750 billion right into the market. And we're going to buy assets. We're going to do everything we need to do and get this taken care of quickly. Well, keep in mind, that's $750 billion, same size as the $800 billion facility that was created for all of TARP, or proposed at least for all of TARP. And it did nothing to the market. On Monday morning, the market completely blew it off and it didn't help at all. This morning, the Fed came out and said the same thing. On top of the $750 billion we've already done, and the unlimited facility they provided to the primary broker dealers, which we haven't talked about, on top of those things, which is as high as $1 trillion a day for the last 20 days or so. In addition to all those, they announced on the news, we're going to put $2.3 trillion into the markets as credit facilities for small businesses. Well, the Dow was up 400 points on that, nothing. It's a small response. So for the markets to come out and say, or the Fed to come out and say, hey, we're going to give you $2.2 trillion with a T, and it does nothing, is pretty remarkable. Now, let me put that in perspective for you. Between the 2.2 trillion this morning and the 2.3 trillion that was already created in the stimulus package through the Treasury Department, you're talking about $4.5 trillion. Now, that's the gross domestic product of Japan. Japan's the third largest economy on planet Earth. So that's basically, they just spent what Japan earns in a year, they just spent in 3 weeks. And the economy does not care at all. So what that tells you is the rules are changing. I want to give you a real specific example to show you what this looks like right now. This is, I'm going to give you a clue into what the liquidity cycle in the United States looks like. And we're just going to look at it through the lens of mortgage banking itself, because you may or may not know that mortgage banking is one of the primary sources of liquidity on planet Earth. Now, by the time you walk away from this slide alone, you're going to know more than most bankers know. And so try to dig into this. Most guys in the mortgage industry don't even know how this works. And so this is kind of hopefully something that's really useful to you. And it's also going to be important, I think, for you to understand, because it's going to teach you more about what's happening in the market right now. So let's take a look at this liquidity cycle. It starts with Joe the home buyer, and Joe the home buyer is kind of at the top of the list, right? Joe America says, hey, I want to buy a house, but he doesn't have the purchase price of a house all saved up. He's got to go out and he's got to get a loan for that. So the first thing Joe does is he identifies the house he wants to live in, and he calls an agent, and there's lots and lots of agents on the phone right now. And he calls one of you guys and he says, hey, I'm interested in buying a house. And once you show him that house, then they say, well, gosh, you don't have $400,000, $500,000 in cash. Okay, you're going to need a loan. So what happens is he calls a bank like mine. He calls Modern Mortgage and he says, hey guys, we need a loan. Well, because that loan is collateralized by the house, what I mean when I say collateral is the house stands collaterally. It stands to the side of and along with the client as a guarantor of the loan. Because there's collateral, we say, okay, great, we'll write you a loan. And when we write that loan, we have to write that loan according to agency guidelines. So we facilitate the underwriting for that by going to underwriters who will underwrite according to agency guidelines. Now, when we say agency guidelines, what we're talking about is Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and you see them there, FNMA and FHLMC. Now, FHA has its own guidelines as well, but they're written by HUD. And so I didn't include HUD on this because I don't want to get too deep into the weeds. But just for now, suffice to say, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, that's FHLMC, and FHA, and in our business, we call FHA Ginnie Mae because that's the kind of bond that gets created on the outside. So Fannie Mae bond, Freddie Mac bond, and a Ginnie Mae bond, what that means is that the loans inside the bond conform to the guidelines written by those groups. Now, Fannie Mae and FHLMC, Freddie Mac, Fannie and Freddie are governed by one office, and that office is called FHFA, okay? That's the Federal Housing Finance Authority, and FHFA is run by one guy, and I don't like him very much. If you've seen my latest Modern Minute, then you know that I'm not a big fan of the guy who runs FHFA. And we're going to talk a little bit more about him in a moment. But as we do, I want you to understand this, have a deeper understanding of how the liquidity cycle works. So we underwrite according to these. And because we've underwritten according to these guidelines, we can now sell the loan into the secondary market. Now, the secondary market is called the secondary market, but because it's secondary to the client's transaction. So Joe has already closed with me, and I funded Joe's loan. So now I've got Joe's loan on my books. Well, if I just keep Joe's loans on my books, I can make a few loans every year and then I have to stop because each loan's about $500,000. And so once I get to the top number that I've got all saved up or available, then I can no longer fund more loans for anybody. So I would have no liquidity. So instead, the United States economic system created this great innovation. and here's how it works. So once I've got Joe's loan on my books, I can sell that loan to a market that's second to Joe. So it's called the secondary market. And that secondary market is buying all kinds of loans. And they're buying millions and millions of loans all the time. And as they buy those loans, they're looking for ways to group them together into boxes that make the same, that are very, very similar. So let's, for instance, say they take all these same kinds of loans. In our example, we're just pretending it's at 4%. It's got the same interest rate. It's got the same risk characteristics. And how do I know the risk characteristics? Because it was underwritten according to those agency guidelines, right? So that's the role those agency guidelines play. They help us make sure that the secondary market knows what it's buying. Now, when they buy those, they get them from all kinds of places. They're called aggregators. So they get a bunch of loans from me and a bunch of loans from the guy up the street and a bunch of loans from a banker in New York. And they put them all together because they all fit the same agency guideline status. And they put them all in a box. And that box is called a mortgage-backed security. And you can see that kind of middle there, that mortgage-backed security. A mortgage-backed security is now an instrument that can be sold into the financial markets. And what underlies that bond, it is a bond, that's the kind of interest instrument it is. What underlies that bond is the fact that Joe has promised to make his payment. Now, Joe's promised to make his payment at an interest rate of 4%. And so what happens is a servicing company comes along, and that's the biggest names you know. It's places like Wells Fargo and Penny Mac and Mr. Cooper, the folks who are in the news right now. And what they do is they buy all these mortgage-backed securities from us, and then they earn a profit by offering servicing. What servicing is, hey, we promise to help the people make the payment. We'll keep track of whether or not they're on time, and we'll take responsibility for delivering the underlying investment value to clients down the road. Now, don't let me lose you on this. Here's how this works. If the interest rate's 4%, the servicing company takes a portion off the top. And it's usually 1 to 1.5%. It fluctuates with the market, but in this example, just to keep things around, it's 1.5%. Okay, so Wells Fargo and Penny Mac and Mr. Cooper, they all take their 1.5%. And then they have a big infrastructure underneath. They've got all kinds of call centers and all kinds of liquidity facilities and all kinds of other things that help people actually make the payment. And they're the ones you got to call if you get foreclosed on, if something goes wrong, or when you need a forbearance, that's who you're calling, okay? When you call those guys, they strip off their 1.5%, and that's usually, in the parlance of our business, that's called the strip. What is underneath all of that is what we call the coupon rate, or the yield of the bond. And so if you guys want to go back to my last webinar to understand how bonds work, check out that there's a slide in there and a whole recording of me teaching you how the bond itself actually pays. But mortgage-backed securities often pay something like 2.5%, 3.5%, 4.5%, depending on the kind of market that they're in. Well, what that means is that the underlying bond holder earns the 2.5%. So then the question becomes, who is the underlying bond buyer? Well, that bond buyer is basically you and me. In your 401k, when your financial advisor is always telling you to buy stocks and bonds, many times out of 10, the bonds that financial advisor means are mortgage-backed securities bonds. And some of the biggest companies in America, biggest financial companies in America, have made their money by selling mortgage-backed security bonds, or MBSs. Another big section of bonds are treasury bills. That's when the government makes the debt and promises to pay it back. But when the government does it, the T-bill market, that's called treasury bills, the yield is much, much lower because there's considered to be no risk, because Uncle Sam will always pay you back, or at least that's the idea. And if Uncle Sam's always going to pay you back, then they don't have to give you very much of a yield because your money's so safe. People know that there could be some trouble in mortgage-backed securities. There has been in the past. Default rates are generally historically very, very low, but it's still worth it and to get a little premium, and so the yields are a little bit higher. That's why you see that 2.5%. Now think about this. This is so important because the payment that Joe, the homeowner, is making, only a small portion of that goes to the big, bad, ugly, so-called too big to fail banks. Only a small portion of it goes to them. The rest of it actually goes to the bond buyer. And the bond buyer is a huge pension fund or a 401k. So if you were a teacher your whole life and you got para in Colorado, or you were a street sweeper, or you were a person who worked for AT&T hanging lines, or if you were just a 401k person who just put your money in your 401k your whole life, the safest part of your pension is supposed to be the bond. And so because of that, the servicer is required to pay the coupon rate no matter what. So if the person doesn't pay the mortgage, well, the servicer still has to write a check to support all those pensioners. Because guess what? They need their monthly check in order to live, right? So if you spent your whole life working at the telephone company and you were a faithful guy working there, the telephone company doesn't have enough money to pay you the rest of your life. So they have to go invest the money. And when they do, what they buy is largely bonds. I hope you're starting to understand why this is so important, because Joe, the home buyer who bought his own home, but also has a 401k, he's providing himself the liquidity for his loan. He's literally the beginning and the very end of the liquidity cycle. Now that liquidity cycle is a beautiful cycle. It's extremely efficient. It's extremely low risk. It has very, very high yields for the amount of risk in the system. And it tends to work very, very well. And in fact, it's created more home ownership per capita than any country on planet Earth. And it's resulted in more wealth as a result of that, more community stability, more infrastructure, more municipal tax bases than any other plan on planet Earth. It's a really elegant, beautiful, simple system when you understand how it works. And you can see I'm a big fan of it. Guess when it was invented? It was actually invented in 1934 as by FDR and his New Deal as a result of the liquidity crisis that resulted from the Great Depression. So you guys might remember that movie, It's a Wonderful Life. If you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, it starts off with the main character who eventually asks himself if he should even be alive, and he thinks about throwing himself off a bridge. Before he does that, all of his clients run into his little savings and loan, and they all say, hey, Jimmy Stewart, give us our money back. And he says, well, I don't have your money. Your money's in his tractor and her farm. And he starts trying to explain to them how banking used to work, which is that once the bank has lent the money it has in deposits, there's no more to lend. And of course, that fact is the reason if you can't lend enough money, you can't lubricate the system, there's not liquidity. But this works because when I sell my loan to the secondary market, they pay me back. And when they pay me back, guess what I do with that money? I go back out and I lend it to another guy, another Joe. Now it's Jane. And I move from Joe and Jane on to John, and we keep moving through the system until everybody gets a home loan. Well, I'm able to do it because the secondary market buys my loans from me. And the secondary market, they would run out of money too if they didn't have a big buyer for their loans. And of course, the big buyers for their loans are those bonds buyers. Now, I want you to know as I explain how this works that I'm stripping out some complexity from this. There is some complexity here because I'm not explaining all of the ins and outs of the government oversight process, and I'm not explaining all the ins and outs of the big buyers of the bonds, but just know, in effect, this becomes the result. So I know I've got some financial professionals on here, and those professionals, you may or may not have a deeper understanding of how this works. And I want you to know it does go a bit deeper than this. But in general, if you understand how this works, you understand about 95% of the liquidity cycle, and the little details really won't change your understanding at all, okay? So now take a look at this. If I go to my next slide here, here's what's being currently proposed by FHFA, folks who I believe are kind of following a status quo rule book. What they're saying is, we are going to keep this normal cycle. We're only going to break it in a couple of key points to protect Main Street. And what we're going to do is we're going to say to the servicer, well, hey, Mr. Servicer, we're going to tell all of the Joe Americas out there that they don't have to make their payment. And guess what? By telling your servicers that they don't have to make their or your homeowners that they don't have to make their payments, you've got, as of this morning, over 2 million requests for forbearance. Now, I just want you to think that through with me. The average mortgage payment coast to coast in America, a little higher in Denver, little lower in the Midwest, much higher on the West Coast. But the average is probably about 1,200 bucks. That's a low side of the average, okay? So if 2 million homeowners say, I'm not gonna send you $1,200 this month, that's $240 million. That's $250 million not going to the servicers this month. Well, that would be fine. They don't, I actually think that's a very, very good idea that the CARES Act is providing forbearance. It's really good to know that these guys don't have to make their payments if they don't have to. So that's a plus, right? That helps keep people in their homes. The problem is FHFA did not create any kind of a facility for the servicers. So they still have to write that check for $240 million, because if they don't write that check, then all those pensioners and bondholders and 401ks and all those other formal bond owners, they don't get their money this month. And if they don't get their money this month, then the seizing in the bond market gets much, 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 much worse, because you can't sell the bond. So you can see what a big problem we have when FHFA says you don't need any help for the servicers. So what the servicers have done in response to that is say, the first thing we're going to do, because we think that they're going to figure this out, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to call the primary dealers. They're calling me. And they're saying, hey, we're not buying any risky loans anymore. So they get rid of things like jumbo loans, and they talk about getting rid of FHA, and they're coming down hard on CHFAs, and they're making credit scores have to go up, and down payments are getting bigger, and interest rates are going up. All of that is the servicers reacting to the fact that they have to write a $240 million check this month, and they don't have any promise of that money coming back in. Now, if they had to write that check because they had done bad business, I would say, hey, that's a moral hazard. You guys had a bad business model. It didn't work. You're not too big to fail. You guys can go. But that's not what's happening. They're actually in trouble because Uncle Sam said Joe doesn't have to make his payment. Now, you can see the size of the problem here. So the initial reaction was, well, FHFA will figure this out. It's too big a problem. And I have spoken to many of you, and in fact, I have put this out in the public on our Modern Minutes, and I've said, hey, look, there's a big tidal wave coming. This is a big problem, but we think it's going to get fixed. Well, it's not getting fixed. As of just 2 days ago, Calabria, the guy who is the head of the FHFA, has said, we will provide no facility to servicers. So what he's saying is, I understand the problem. I don't care. I don't think it's a problem. He says there is no systemic risk. And in saying there's no systemic risk, what he means is, he thinks if the servicers have to write a $240 million check 1 or 2 times, he doesn't think that'll hurt them. Well, the problem is that will hurt them really, really, really bad. They don't have $500 million that they can simply write off. Most of those companies don't have that money, because what they do to buy all those mortgages from me is they use a liquidity cycle as well. So they borrow the money to buy the money that I loaned to Joe. That's starting to sound like a nursery rhyme. And when they don't have their cash reserves in place, then the banks that they borrowed the money from do what are called margin calls. And they say, hey, you have to pay us back. And we're seeing margin calls all across the industry. You're going to see some big names, if there's not a facility very quickly, some big names are going to go out of business. And you're going to be one of the very few people who understands why they're going out of business. So the reason I'm sharing this particular cycle with you is because I want you to understand 2 things. Number one, the reason that what is obvious and is not getting fixed is happening is because you have leaders and decision makers who are going from an old playbook. The old playbook would tell these guys, hey, look, just let the Fed liquefy this from the front side of the market. Let the Fed come in and buy mortgage-backed securities. Everything will be fine. But they're not looking at the fact that things are shifting and that the risk in the mortgage industry has changed. Because the risk is now not that someone won't buy the mortgage-backed security. The risk is that the mortgage-backed security I make isn't going to pay me. And if it doesn't pay me, if I buy 100 loans, can anybody on the call, the many, many, many people on the call, can any of you tell us what the risk is of people losing their jobs? The answer is no. Nobody knows. Nobody knows how many people are going to lose their jobs. We know 16 million have lost their jobs. We know we're at 10% unemployment in 3 weeks. If we're at 20% unemployment in another week or 2, what does that do to mortgage payments? What should interest rates be? What should forward pricing be? So you can see how big a problem this is. And the other reason I wanted to dig into this is because I know the majority of the phone call is financial professionals and realtors. And so I want you to have a real world example, a very specific example to pull out of the news to see it's not just a difference of opinion. It's not like there were two good opinions in the Great Depression. There was actually one right way to go and one wrong way to go. It's not like there was two kind of agree to disagree with how to take care of a crisis in the panic of 1857. There was only one way to do that, only one way, and that was the Civil War, right? And so that's where we're at right now. There's only one way to fix this, and that's to provide a facility to these servicers if you're going to allow forbearance. And yet, they're not doing it. I don't know if you're as shocked as I am, but I am completely shocked that that's happening. So we continue to press and push. Through our back channels, have called for Calabria's job. Hopefully he'll get replaced. I saw this morning that the president of the NBA came out and did the same thing. He sent a letter to Congress and to the Treasury Department, Steve Mnuchin, asking for his job. Obviously, that guy's got a much bigger bully pulpit than I do, and so hopefully he'll be fired and replaced with a banker. But I hope this makes sense to you guys, and am eager for your feedback. But let's do this. Let's kind of switch. You got that example. You're seeing it around you. Hopefully I don't have to connect those dots too much more explicitly. I think this is what's useful for us to consider. What should we expect? How should things change now? What should the world kind of start to look like now? Well, look, we can answer this question in every single one of the various different categories of life. We could talk about what to expect socially. What does history tell us we can expect socially? Well, it can tell us a few things. It can tell us things like even what we'll see in every aspect of life. What will we see in television shows? You'll see television shows that tend to be collectivistic. You'll see sentiment in society that tends to be collectivistic instead of individualistic. So for instance, whereas our old heroes would have been John Wayne and kind of the lone cowboy riding off into the sunset, that's not how it'll be anymore. It'll be teams, more like the Avengers. You're going to see more of that stuff start to rise. Fashion, even fashion, and I know this sounds crazy because I'm not a particularly fashionable guy, but I will tell you this. Fashion, there's something about people who are in fashion. They tend to be able to sense what's coming. And in fact, Virginia and I, a couple of months back, were talking about how style had moved back towards kind of militaristic looking things, you know, cargo pants and epaulettes on shoulders and tighter lines. All of these kinds of things indicate kind of that militaristic sort of fascistic instinct. Now, you'll start to see that stuff continue to grow. You'll see things like organized religion will get less popular, and things like social programs more popular. You'll start to see exactly those kinds of things. All of that is a big deal. Now, think about in the financial, the economic, the investment categories. Let's just think about those parts of life. You'll start to see in the short term, a further drop in equities. I've had lots and lots of you, and God bless you, lots and lots of you are asking, hey, do I think it's a good time to invest in the stock market? Here's the moment in every conversation where I have to say I'm not a financial advisor, and so check with your financial advisor, but short answer is no, I wouldn't touch equities right now. They have to retrace, and I would even predict the S&P will retrace as far as 1,500, believe it or not. It's got a long way to fall yet. Despite the little bull runs you're seeing lately, those are just called head fakes. We saw, watch in the news as you're seeing these head fakes occur. They're going to keep saying this is the best day on the market since. And when they say since, look how often they're pointing to the Great Depression. I saw it again this morning. Hey, we've had the best weekly close, the best single day rise since 1938. Okay, well, that was the Great Depression. So you don't want to see those kinds of head fakes. You want to stay clear of that stuff. How should you be thinking about investing? Well, you should be thinking about the rules changing. You should be thinking about Not all of the rules that you've been taught in the past, things like buy the dip or a quote diversified portfolio. Well, what's a diversified portfolio? If you were in stocks or bonds and there's a liquidity crisis, they both fell. Literally, you have what's called a correlation of one. So there is no diversity there. That isn't how you should be investing. You should be planning for things like substantial inflation. Inflation is a function of how much money is in the system. And if you just pump Japan's GDP into your economy in a 3-week period, you've got too much money in the system, particularly because that money is not restricted to a category. So think about this. In 2008, we pumped trillions, or I should say from 2008 through about 2018, we pumped trillions and trillions of dollars into the economy. But those trillions of dollars were targeted towards asset prices. And so stocks went up, real estate went up, gold went up, everything went up as a result of the Fed pumping money into the system, as a result of their what's called quantitative easing, or that troubled asset approach, that buying assets. When they did that, all that money is restricted inside those asset classes, which is not good, but is better than just shooting money into the economy. If you were to just open up any failed economic like country that failed based on an economic system in history, you could go to the Weimar Republic of Germany that started World War II. You could go to Argentina of the 90s. You could look at Asian cultures. You could look at Zimbabwe now. What they all do that really creates a huge problem is they send money to the population. The very worst thing you could possibly do in an economic crisis is basically send $1,200 to each family that qualifies. And the reason is because of how they will behave when they get the $1,200. It's too small a number to have any impact on what we would describe as their financial fate. All it does is give them the ability to consume necessities, right? Well, when you have $2.2 trillion trying to consume necessities, all you do is push the price of those necessities up. So if everybody goes and buys, I've told you before, milk and eggs and cheese, then you have a real price problem with milk and eggs and cheese. It looks like demand is coming in, but it's not demand, it's just more dollars. And so more dollars create inflation. So your investment plans should favor things like inflation. You should be looking at each one of the categories of your life and asking the question, in what way are the rules changing? What rules did I follow to get here? And rules can sometimes be hard to see. They sometimes seem like they underlie the economy, but they're not that hard to see. They end up coming out in axioms. They end up coming out in little sayings and statements we say all over the place. So you can't help but still hear quite a few of them. So one of the rules might be buy the dip. That's a pretty common rule. Well, people will say, hey, if the stock market's down, buy. And they did that, right? You're going to see other little things rise up. I just want you to watch the news for enemies. Enemies will kind of roll up. So some of those enemies might be China. Now, China has already been being posited as an enemy to us for the last many years, pre-Trump as well, not just Trump, but we've sort of been talking about them as a threat for a while. But now that was more about the CCP, the Chinese government. And our thought was, hey, the people are good, it's just the government that's not. Now you're seeing the rhetoric change and you're seeing lots of things about bat soup and other descriptions of people. Those kind of things you'll see these enemies rise. You could see, for instance, the seeds of war will start to be being planted. That's a pretty common thing for a bridge. The thing that followed Buchanan, of course, was the Civil War. The thing that followed Hoover was World War II. It's pretty reasonable to expect that we've probably got another pretty substantial war coming. And I don't say that flippantly. I say it sadly. It's not a war like the Afghanistan war. It's not a war like World War I. It's not a war like the War of 1812. It's not the little wars, the skirmishes, the wars that history looks at as being smaller. It's the large existential kind of war that changes an entire society and makes them different from what they were prior. And so I would expect that something like that's coming. And war itself may be changed. I don't know that we're talking about amassing on a foreign battlefield, although that's possible. But I will tell you this, when it arises, it will be considered a moral war. So those in our country who are fighting on behalf of it, they won't look at it like other recent wars and say, we should stop doing this or bring the troops home. They're going to say things more like, send our boys over, like they did in the Civil War, like they did in the Revolutionary War, like they did in World War II. It'll be considered by our population to be a moral war to be engaged in. Could be over things like Greenland, surprisingly. There's a lot of reasons to go to war over Greenland. So Trump's tweets on Greenland were not just a joke. That there is actually a huge strategic value in Greenland, and you may or may not know that China and Russia both are trying to get outposts in Greenland for lots of reasons. So I don't want to go too much into all that stuff. I'm going to open it up for questions here in just a moment, but as I do, again, send all your questions in, do them on the chat, send them to Virginia, however you want to do it. But what I want you to recognize is this is what is practical here. This is what matters. The first thing you have to understand is the power of narrative. Human beings are designed to respond to messages. We live our lives according to messages that we believe are true. And the message that you hold, the message that you allow to be true, is going to determine much, much more than you think. And so I don't want to just break away. I don't want to just miss this opportunity to talk to you like you're nothing but financial professionals, realtors, and home loan consumers. I think you're more than that. I think you're full people. And so I want to remind you, what are the narratives you're living according to in every aspect of your life? Your spiritual narrative, what do you believe is true? The narrative about your children, your relationships, your marriage, where you live, how you live, about your own health. What are the narratives, the stories that you tell yourself are true, and then you act according to them? Because if those narratives are powerful enough to move economies into war, then they are powerful enough to move you into the kind of life you're trying to live. There is a better way to live than another. There are superior ways of thinking. There are superior ways of behaving than others. There aren't superior people. People are never more valuable than another person, but one person may have a more useful narrative than someone else. And so I want to encourage you to challenge your narratives and make sure that you're clear on what they are. Make sure that they serve you because you're in control of what they are. And make sure that you're living a life that is wise. And we're going to continue to walk in that role. Now, as I do, again, I'm not a financial guy, not a financial advisor, but I am going to tell you this, because we have so many financial professionals and realtors. I do want to tell you guys this. Here's what's not going to happen. Here's what's 100% easy to rule out. There isn't going to be a society after this shift, and I believe this shift will probably take us about 18 months. On the other side of this shift, I don't think you're going to live in a world that doesn't consume real estate. It's going to consume a ton of real estate. It's going to have to consume real estate because real estate's a function of need, A, and B, super important, you need to know this, real estate itself is one of the best hedges against inflation you can possibly buy. And here's why. If I have a big portfolio of real estate and I bought it in today's dollars, and then I move into a situation with substantial inflation, then what happens is my dollars from today get real easy to pay back. We call that monetization of debt. That's what literally monetization means. It means the benefiting of old debt by new dollars. So if I'm going to benefit from inflation and I've got a couple of properties and the rent today is $1,100, well, when there's a lot more money in the system because everybody's getting $1,200, then it's not that hard for me to increase rents from $1,100 to $1,200 to $1,400 to $1,800. And just as history points out the things we're considering from a macroeconomic standpoint, so does history also give us a lot of confidence in knowing that inflationary environments are really, really good for cash flow. Now, what they're not great for is appreciation, surprisingly. Appreciation takes off later, But through the inflationary period, you don't see inflation. You're not going to see the houses appreciate all that much. That doesn't matter. People shouldn't have been buying for appreciation anyway. If you're investing in real estate, you should have been buying it for cash flow. If you're buying real estate to live in it, good news. Your debt is going to be easier to pay back now than it was before. And if you don't believe me, ask your grandma what she bought her house for, because she lived in a house pretty similar to the one you're living in. And in fact, it's cool now to live in a house that's from the early 1900s or 1920s, 1930s. That's the same house people lived in the Depression, literally the same house, right? But when they paid for that house, they paid $2,800 for it, and you're paying $600,000 for it in downtown Denver. Why? Only because of inflation. So it's important to understand that, and inflation really, really benefits real estate over the long term when you consider it through the lens of cash flow. So I hope that little piece is helpful to you. We want to talk more about it with you, and so follow up with us. But I see some questions coming in. One's from Dave Grieve. Hey, Dave. What, if any, opportunities do you see arising from the scenario you've outlined for homeowners and investors? Yeah, good preemptive question. The opportunities I see are the opportunities for real estate to become the sweetheart investment class for even more reasons. Number one, I mean, shoot, here you've got all these people who have just learned that the stock market's not going to perform, is not taking good care of them. Now, add to that, how are they going to behave on the other side of this when their capital starts to return? Well, if you're going to be investing in the S&P, just your typical index, the problem is that index is now buried under, $5 trillion worth of so-called stimulus. That stimulus is going to slow recoveries over the next, 10 years. So, and I'm not kidding. When we look at Japan, they call it the lost 3 decades. 30 years they've been doing this, buying their own assets through their Fed, their equivalent of the Fed. And the effect is pretty substantial. It drowns out the returns of their businesses. So I think what you're going to see, Dave, and all listening, is that the returns on stocks are going to go down, but the risks are going to be the same or higher. So now the pitch to the investing public is this. You can either buy a stock with a 50 to 70% risk to principal and a return of maybe annualized 3 to 5%, or you could just buy real estate. And so I think you're going to see Joe America say, hey, look, I want things that perform well under inflation. Gold is not accessible to me. There's not enough of it out there. I'm not just going to go buy tons of gold. If I buy gold, I'm going to buy, $2 grand or $5 grand or 20 grand. I mean, retail gold doesn't even sell for more than about 100 grand, right? But in terms of investing in properties, there's still going to be loans for them, and people are going to absolutely go out there and consume real estate. So I think the future for real estate is very, very bright. My money's where my mouth is. That's where my main holdings are and will continue to be. Next question here, Jake Slater. In underwriting, hey, Jake, hope you're getting through this well, bud. In understanding investment properties, what number should we now be using to account for the inflation over the next 5 to 10 years? Okay, this is a really good question, Jake. The answer, I can give us a couple of tools to help us dig for it, but the answer is currently unknowable. We cannot know, and here's why. Because philosophically, what's shifting is a new set of rules, and you're going to see this emerge. You're going to start, we've been in economic circles, we've been talking about it for 20 years, and it's been a tongue-in-cheek joke. But all of a sudden, people are taking seriously the notion of what's called MMT. And so if you guys want to, after this webinar, go out and Google modern monetary theory, you're going to hear a lot about A's and B's and agencies and non-agency performers, all these kinds of ideas that describe how money works. But the basic thesis is this: what if the government can just print money and doesn't really need taxation and doesn't really need productivity? Why can't the Fed produce $2.2 trillion in a morning? Who's to say they can't? That's the question that MMT is asking. We used to just laugh it away, and I still do laugh it away, but unfortunately, there are a lot of people who want to believe it's true, and so because of that, they're starting to encourage it. So you're going to see the amount of inflation you can expect to see is literally an unknowable quotient. All you can know now is, you can ask the following questions. Do I see people starting to buy the idea that some entity, the Fed in this case, can just print an unlimited amount of money with no consequences? Do I believe that's true? It doesn't matter if you believe it's true. Do they believe it's true? If they believe it's true, it's going to affect real estate. It's going to affect the amount of money that's in the system. And so while I don't think you can currently quantify what it is, I think you can feel very, very confident in knowing that it's coming. The other thing I'm going to add to that is, as you consider the landscape today with regard to inflation, almost everybody is going to tell you that you can't have inflation. And the reason you can't have inflation is because the Fed won't allow it to go up. And when you dig into their answers, the answer is going to be, if you say, well, why can't inflation go up? Then the answer is, well, because the debt is too big. And so the Fed would never allow the rates on that to go up. Well, first of all, that's a ridiculous notion. Just because the debt is too big doesn't mean that interest rates can't rise or that inflation can't rise. And so the explanations for why inflation won't be coming are foolish, but you're going to see a lot of them out there. And so, guys, I hope this has been helpful. I still see some questions coming in. I'm going to turn, since the PowerPoint's done, I'm going to turn my camera back on. And if you've got more questions, things you'd like to discuss, things that are just happening for you specifically, or questions that you have about the macro economy in general, we'd love to hear those. And take advantage of this community. I don't even have to be the only one answering, but I do want to say, if you've got comments or other questions, feel free to kind of jump in now and let us know what those comments and questions are. Is this useful information to you? Is this helping you get a feel for what's going on out there? Or is this way out of left field? Anybody disagree with me? Anybody think this is useless information? So continue to interact with us and tell us what things are looking like. In the meantime, so thankful for you guys. I see some questions coming up. Let me let you go ahead and ask your questions verbally, which is another way to do that. And we'll let Virginia moderate that now. And so with questions coming up, go ahead and ask those. Hi, Yvonne. Thank you for that. Let's see, Yvonne, I think you might be muted, my dear. Try to click the microphone and take off so you're not muted. Thank you, Heather. Yvonne, if you've still got a question, go ahead and click that little microphone and we'll be able to hear you. It might be out now. That's all right. Guys, thanks so much. One question, looks like we got one coming in from Steph Weber. Will we be able to rewatch? Yes, we're recording all of this for you. And I know, oh, good, Yvonne, glad you're doing good. Yeah, I know this is a little bit like drinking from a fire hose. And some of you have been so kind in saying that you're spending a lot of time with the Modern Minutes and you're digging into this stuff. So yeah, we're going to leave it out there for you. There'll be a version of this coming your way. And so got another question here coming from Lindsay. So helpful. After getting into all this debt, how do we start to recover? Do you think we could see changes to capital gains laws and real estate down the road? Great question. I would say this, Lindsay, you're going to see, if history is a guide, you're going to see changes to taxation of everything. So even the huge pools of 401k assets that were supposed to be non-taxable, they'll find ways to get into those. They did that in the past. You will see a kind of shift, whereas before we used to put precedence on the individual. One of the ways we did that was individual property. And we would say, hey, look, you can never take somebody's assets. You can never take somebody's 401k. They invested in that believing it would be tax-free. Well, they told that to people in World War II as well. They said, they'll never take your assets. And of course, the main holding in the United States was gold. The gold was actually confiscated by FDR in World War II, believe it or not. And people say, well, that's a one-off. Well, yeah, but literally the 13th Amendment, the emancipation of the slaves, is a confiscation of property. Now, it happens to be an extremely moral confiscation of property to free that property, but it's the same sentiment. And the idea was you don't just get to own a human anymore, But you have to understand this nuance. When the government said you can't own humans anymore, they weren't saying because it's wrong to own a human. Moralistic people were saying that, but that's not what the government's view was. Buchanan said, we can't do it. Dred Scott, the Supreme Court, said, we can't tell you it's right or wrong. The reason it ultimately became wrong and slaves were, quote, confiscated, to use this same construct, is because it gave the South an unfair economic advantage over the North, because they had a free labor source and they could outstrip them with cotton versus wool, which you had to pay for. So same thing happened in World War II. So yes, all your asset classes are going to be confiscated, I'm going to use that term, through greater taxation. So income taxes will go up. You'll see greater taxation on things like every asset you own, your tax-free, your qualified stuff, they'll tax it in another way. Even if they let it grow tax-free, they're going to tax it more when it comes out. You'll see them doing kind of politically correct ways to do it. But the thrust of the idea is allow this taxation now because it's good for society. And so you're going to see this kind of cultural change there, which is interesting. So Mandy Dillman asks, how can we help get Calabria out? Oh, thank you for that. Do I have a sample letter we can send? Yes, I will send you one. In fact, we'll include that with the Modern Minute this evening. And you guys send that out. This isn't one of these cases where we have a well-meaning guy doing his best. We have a guy who does not know what he's doing. And so it's the evil of ignorance. Sometimes people do evil things because they're too dumb to know they're not doing it. And literally, I think I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt by saying that. Otherwise, he intentionally wants to see the fall of the servicers. For some reason, I cannot imagine. It might just be the opportunity to confiscate that process. Great question here from Dell. Contradiction, question mark. Rental real estate owners are beginning to lose cash flow rent due to tenant job losses. Short-term problem, what type of real estate is best? Great questions, yes. And you're exactly right. So in the short term, through this, now keep in mind, through this little bridge area, I'm not gonna encourage you to be buying things. So I think in this, while we kind of figure out this next 6-8 weeks, I think there's a lot of wisdom in thinking about what's happening. Rental real estate owners like myself, we are hearing from tenants. I'm having some of my tenants call and they're saying, hey, look, I lost my job. I can't make it happen. The rental real estate itself is still profitable, although less so, but that is a short-term phenomenon. And in fact, buying rental real estate in, say, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks is going to make, I think, a lot of sense because it's going to be that last best opportunity to buy it with today's money. There will be that transitional period where we kind of call it inertial. And so if I throw a ball up in the air, that ball travels straight up. But there's a moment when there's a difference between the amount of energy I put under it and the energy that gravity is forcing down, where the ball literally just stops, right? And so we're kind of moving into that inertial moment. But as we come through that, you're going to start to see, and it can last, and inertia can last, a week, and it can last 18 months. It's hard to know how long that period will last. But I really believe because of inflation, real estate wins on the other side of it. Now, I will say this, that real estate, because I know some things about you and I know that you have the capacity to purchase it in ways other folks may not necessarily. Let me say this for the group. The real estate that does best will be leveraged real estate because it has the ability to have people pay it back for you. That's part of your return, and cash flow is improved that way. So hopefully that helps. But Elaine says, I'd love to have your slide about the cycle. Yes, we'll have that. You'll have the entire thing here. We'll post this whole deal and you can have the entire Webby. We'll post it on our website and other our social media channels as well. Paul asks, how will the shift in paradigm, the new rules, allow or prevent ideas like free college, free healthcare that are being advocated by the quote left? Are those merely products of modern monetary theory? Good question, Paul. They're the same sentiment. And what I would tell you is, again, if history is a guide, think about the kinds of programs we launched coming out of what you might describe as the New Deal. The society going into the New Deal would never have thought of things like even state-sponsored colleges. If you wanted to go to college, you went to Harvard. And by the way, Harvard cost about 1 year of good labor. It didn't cost what it costs now, which is about 10 years of good labor, right? You are going to see huge collectivistic government programs come in and do things you never thought they could do. I do think things like Jubilee are a real potential. And Jubilee is an ancient idea. It comes from Jewish law. The idea of Jubilee was the sort of forgiveness of debt. So I would be expecting things like student loan forgiveness, even though they'll come up with some construct to make that socially acceptable. It'll be the same difference. All kinds of debt forgiveness are on the table, all kinds of social programs to allow debt to be dealt with in different ways. That can be good. The problem is it shifts the debt. If it doesn't actually eliminate it and readjust asset prices with it, then it doesn't have the right effect. So Gabe coming in, very good info, thanks. Yeah, glad to help, man. I'm glad that these are useful tasks for you, or useful information for you. Thanks for that feedback, and it's a great encouragement. Really appreciate you guys who are telling us that you're using the information, that it's helping you. We've got lots of folks doing that. Just means the world to us. And Gabe and all those others, please send the information out. Adam, when you say, quote, today's money, are you suggesting that we're heading towards a depression era, wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread, and a complete devaluation of the dollar? Good question, Jason. What I am suggesting is you need to think about the way that we come back to each one of these shifts, these big shifts in narrative. Every time we come back to them a level up. We have more information and more tools at hand. So I'm not suggesting that physical cash is going to behave in the same way it has in the past, and in the way that you're describing, which is the Weimar Republic, where we saw these babushkas, these Russian and German grandmas bringing wheelbarrows full of money to buy a loaf of bread. I'm not suggesting that you'll actually need that much physical cash, but what I am suggesting is that what your cash currently buys will be significantly devalued. And in fact, I would argue that that's already happening. You're already seeing the evidence of that in, frankly, the rise of asset prices. So asset prices have gone up, and the way we talk about them is they've become less affordable. When we say they're less affordable, what we mean is it takes more dollars to get them now than it used to. Well, that was just in asset prices because the Fed was just putting money in asset prices. But everything's going to become less affordable in the sense that the amount of dollars it takes to get everything is going to rise. Now, are you going to see that happen overnight? I hope not. What history would say is that sending $1,200 to every family is a really good way to make it rise overnight. And I hope that doesn't happen, but you should know it's on the table. That's why it's so important to have assets that are tied to cash flow. So if rents go through the roof tomorrow, then you change your rents and they go from $1,100 to $4,500 a month. And you go, well, I could never raise it $4,500 a month. Well, you'll have to keep in mind by that moment in time, your average earner is going to be earning $120,000 a year. You say, well, that's crazy. Well, I know it sounds crazy, but keep in mind that the average annual earnings in 1975 were about $3,500 bucks. And now if you earned $3,500 a year, you'd be less than, so deeply impoverished, we couldn't even consider it. So yes, I do think that's happening. I do think a devaluation is coming. Now, in the short term, you're actually going to see the dollar continue to get stronger, but that's a function of the monetary system. That's what we call a short squeeze in the dollar. That's happening because foreign currencies and debtors, people who borrow money and make money, are going to have to get their hands on more dollars. So it's going to create a short-term demand spike. And we've already seen that. If you're watching the dollar, you're watching the dollar trade very, very strong against other assets right now. That's a bad thing for the dollar. Some pundits are saying it's good. It's not good. It's not a sign of safety. It's a sign of liquidity crisis. You got too many people needing dollars. They're having to pay premiums to get them. That doesn't mean the fundamentals of the dollar are strong. In fact, what it means is as dollars get more expensive, foreign nations are less able to consume our goods. And when they're less able to consume our goods, manufacturing in the United States drops. So GDP goes down. So we don't want to see a super, super strong dollar. It's already too strong. That's a short-term phenomenon, and I believe headed to a serious devaluation of the dollar. So watch out for that. That's a little bit high level there, but if you have more questions about it, we'll go deeper into it. Celia asks, have you had tenants ask for rental forbearance or forgiveness? And if so, how are you handling those requests? Yes, great question. I have had that. I have had some of my tenants ask for that. The way we've tried to handle that is we were preemptive. We kind of sent out a letter to all those folks saying, hey, we know this is coming. If you need help, let us know. But we're also encouraging them to see modern minutes and realize, like, going in for, try to avoid it if you can. But if you need it, then you need it. And we want to be merciful with those people. We want to be kind with them as much as we possibly can. This is why we always tell people it is vitally important that if you're going to hold real estate, you must hold it with substantial reserves. And I always say you're not safe unless you've got 6 months of that property's PITI, property, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, have to be sitting in an account. So if the monthly mortgage on your investment is $2,000, you need 12,000 bucks in the account. And if you've got 12 bucks in the account, you're safe, because reserves are the only way to hold assets through a bridge. And we're on that bridge now. Now, once you get to the other side of the bridge, you invest, and you invest hard, the hardest you've ever invested in your life. You go as hard as you possibly can with as much conviction as you possibly can. And that's how you build wealth coming out of a recession. Now, interestingly, here's one of these old adages, right? The old adage is wealth is made in a recession. So as soon as the recession starts, I start buying. And I can't tell you, it's got to be more than 100 people have asked me, should I start buying right now? And they're well-meaning, and I don't disagree with them. However, if you're buying right now, I think you're buying too soon. If you're buying the stock market, things like that, it's probably too soon to do that. What you want to do is wait for those to calm down. You lose nothing. If it goes back up without you, how far is it going to go up? 1%, 2%, 3% before you know it's going back up again? 10% even on its way to 200, who cares? Wait until the risk sucks out of the market, then buy. And when you buy hard. Because really, the way investing works best is when you invest with conviction. When you put a lot of money into something, you reduce risk by knowing what to buy and when to buy it. And you balance that by putting a lot of money into it, or as much as you possibly can. So I hope that helps. Another quick question, trying to process how this outlook would change if Calabria is indeed replaced. Good question. And the mortgage liquidity cycle, for example, could be relubricated, and could it be quickly enough to change the trajectory? Good question. Yes, so if Calabria was fired and you put a professional banker in there, I'm talking one of these high-level PhD guys who has overseen banks, understands the theory, can draw that cycle. I drew that cycle on a piece of paper yesterday. It took me 5 seconds. Bankers understand, or should understand, how that works. If you got a guy in there who simply said this very simple fix, we're going to keep forbearance. Forbearance is good, and here's why. It prevents panic. If I have a forbearance in place, then people don't panic. They don't fire sell their real estate trying to get out the door, worried that there's an exit coming. Instead, they stay in their house and they say, look, we don't have to make our payment this month. Thank God, we've got a little protection, a little mercy here. Let's see if we can get back on our feet. You guard those people for 3 months, maybe at the most, right? Not having that panic for 3 months sucks the panic out of the room. That's good. So we like the forbearance side of it. The problem is they didn't, in not protecting the servicer, now the servicer has to write $1 billion check, and they're just private companies. They don't have $1 billion to write. So if the Federal Reserve and or Treasury Department, and I think it should be the Treasury Department, lubricates them and says, don't worry, we're going to make the payment for them, then here's what happens. They make the payment, the servicer can continue to work and pushes back to me and says, hey, Adam, go ahead and make loans and help people buy houses and keep the market moving forward. And by the way, we're still putting that forbearance on the back of the person's loan, so that the person who went into forbearance, when they sell their house or refinance or in some period of time, they still have to pay it back. Then all that money goes right back into the facility. The government doesn't even spend a penny on it. It's just literally floated for a certain period of time. And so this would be, there's no inflation as a result of it. There's no panic as a result of it. And it's frankly a pretty easy fix, which is why I'm so shocked it hasn't been fixed. So guys, we have other stuff. We're so thankful for you being part of this. I hope it's good, useful information. Again, help us like, share, subscribe, figure out how to get in front of as many people as we can. We want to serve them. And in the meantime, thanks for your questions. Thanks for your attention. You guys really honor us in that. If you need anything else, don't hesitate. Email us at hello@mod-mortgage.com, and we'll be there for you. guys, we believe we're built for this crisis. We saw it coming. We were ready for it. And now we feel really able to help our folks get through it. So eager to help you with that and looking forward to help more. Thanks for being on the website today. And thanks for all you do with us. We look forward to helping out soon. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.